Across the forgotten surface of ancient Earth, beneath layers of stone older than imagination, there are epochs so distant that even the passage of dinosaurs appears recent by comparison. These vanished ages lie sealed within the planet's shifting crust, erased by heat, pressure, and the relentless churn of deep time. Entire worlds have come and gone without leaving a coherent record, their stories dissolved into mineral traces and fractured sediment. And it is within this abyss of lost history that a single question emerges with unsettling clarity. If Earth can erase civilizations older than memory, how can humanity expect to preserve perfect certainty about anything, even one of its greatest achievements? This is where our inquiry begins. Not with denial, not with conspiracy, and not with refutation, but with a deeper philosophical problem. The moon landing stands as one of the most well-documented events of the modern age. Its evidence is extensive, multifaceted, and scientifically robust. Yet when examined through the lens of geological reality, a tension emerges. Proof, as humans understand it, exists within narrow windows of stability. It relies on cultural continuity, preserved archives, and the survival of interpretive frameworks. Earth, however, does not honor continuity. Earth annihilates it. The camera moves slowly across a pre-dinosaur landscape reconstructed from geological clues. Towering fungal structures rise from swamp-like expanses in the Carboniferous. Shallow inland seas ripple under Devonian light. Trilobite tracks fade beneath tidal patterns recorded in Cambrian stone. These environments thrived for millions of years, yet almost none of their stories remain intact. The gaps between what once existed and what we can prove become chasms of silence. In those chasms, the mind begins to ask an unspoken question. If intelligence had risen before the dinosaurs, would we ever know? Or would its achievements have disappeared so thoroughly that even the idea of certainty becomes untenable? The tension between memory and erasure is the key to understanding the paradox surrounding the moon landing. This documentary does not question the reality of the mission, but instead interrogates the nature of proof itself. What does it mean to believe in something absolutely when the planet we inhabit deletes its own history with geological indifference? What does it mean to trust that future ages will carry forward the explanations and context necessary to interpret artifacts left upon a distant world? And how does the silence of Earth's deep past reshape our expectations of truth? The camera transitions to the lunar surface, a stark, airless horizon, dust untouched by wind, shadows stretching infinitely across a landscape that preserves everything but explains nothing. Footprints lie frozen in time, immune to erosion. Metal equipment remains exactly where it was placed. And yet the moon, for all its stability, cannot provide meaning. It can only hold fragments. Interpretation resides on Earth, a planet that destroys its own evidence. This contrast between a world that forgets and a world that remembers forms the foundation of the narrative paradox. The moon landing is real. Its documentation is thorough. Its technological triumph undeniable. But the idea that any event can possess definitive proof forever is incompatible with the nature of time itself. Earth's pre-dinosaur epochs reveal that truth is vulnerable not because it is false, but because it depends on memory, context, and continuity. All three are fragile. This introduction sets the stage for an exploration that dives deeper than facts and deeper than doubt. It invites the viewer to consider the limits of certainty on a planet that has lived through countless civilizations of its own making and unmaking. It opens the door to a form of skepticism rooted not in denial, but in humility before a universe that outlives its observers. The camera descends toward a sweeping panorama of exposed rock formations, cliffs carved by vanished oceans, and valleys etched by forces older than the continents themselves. Here, in the quiet immensity of geological time, the Earth reveals a truth that unsettles every assumption human civilization holds about memory, history, and the permanence of proof. This chapter examines the mechanisms through which our planet erases its past so thoroughly that entire epochs, spanning millions of years, leave behind only fragments, distortions, or nothing at all. It is within this erasure that the paradox of definitive lunar proof first begins to take shape. Earth's surface is not a library. It is not an archive. It is a battlefield of processes: subduction, erosion, tectonic uplift, metamorphism, each capable of dismantling the physical traces of civilizations, ecosystems, and worlds long forgotten. The rocks beneath our feet behave like pages of a book constantly rewritten. Sedimentary layers are folded, compressed, or shattered. Igneous intrusions slice through ancient strata, obscuring timelines. Glacial cycles grind landscapes down to bedrock, erasing entire chapters of Earth's story with mechanical indifference. As the camera glides across a cross-section of layered stone, the narration highlights an unsettling observation. Geological records do not accumulate sequentially. They are interrupted, broken, missing. Scientists call these gaps unconformities, blank spaces in the story of Earth. Some represent tens of millions of years lost to erosion or non-deposition. Others correspond to mass extinctions or catastrophic transformations that reshaped ecosystems beyond recognition. But most of these gaps are simply the natural consequence of a planet that does not preserve its history. Within these gaps lies the philosophical possibility that prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs could have risen and vanished without leaving evidence capable of surviving the violence of deep time. This is not an argument for the existence of such civilizations, but rather a demonstration of geological reality. If intelligence emerged, if culture developed, if structures were built, if knowledge expanded, Earth would have erased every trace long before the rise of mammals. The planet's crust, constantly recycled, makes no distinction between the presence or absence of thinking beings. Stone remembers only what survives, and survival is rare. The camera now pans toward metamorphic rock formations buried deep within mountain ranges. These rocks, once sediments or volcanic ash layers, were subjected to pressures so intense that their minerals reorganized, obliterating any original structures or fossils. A hypothetical ruin caught within such transformations would lose its identity entirely. No future civilization would detect intentionality within the crystalline mosaics. They would see only metamorphic fabric, proof of Earth's power to overwrite meaning. This geological amnesia expands our understanding of the limits of proof. Consider a world where even the most resilient materials degrade over millions of years. Metals oxidize, ceramics fracture, plastics break down into chemical remnants. Radiation alters molecular structures. Only the rarest conditions allow fossils or traces to persist, and even then, they offer incomplete stories. Evidence, preserved in fragments at best, cannot convey the totality of what once existed. Interpretation fills the void, and interpretation is always shaped by the present. This growing awareness reframes the question of the moon landing. In the modern era, the evidence supporting Apollo is extensive: telemetry, footage, artifacts, eyewitness accounts, lunar samples analyzed by scientists worldwide. And yet, when placed within the context of Earth's geological indifference, the expectation that such proof can remain eternally intact becomes unrealistic. Earth does not protect meaning. It does not safeguard context. It dismantles both with the same indifferent precision with which it dismantled entire prehistoric worlds. The camera transitions from metamorphic cliffs to deep ocean trenches where tectonic plates descend into the mantle. These subduction zones consume ancient crust, pulling entire regions of Earth downward into a furnace of magma. Any trace of civilization caught upon a subducting plate, stone, metal, or otherwise, would vanish entirely. The ocean floor, often regarded as a stable repository of ancient geology, is itself temporary. It is younger than most continents, and destined to be recycled again. From this vantage point, the philosophical tension gains force. If Earth erases its own past so thoroughly, how can humanity expect any event to retain definitive proof across vast stretches of time? The question does not challenge the reality of the moon landing. It challenges the permanence of proof itself. And in doing so, it aligns with the deeper mystery at the heart of this documentary. Human certainty is a fleeting construct, fragile against the scale of geological processes that have already devoured entire worlds before ours. As the chapter concludes, the camera lingers on a silent landscape shaped by forces beyond human comprehension. Earth's deep amnesia is not a flaw. It is the nature of a dynamic planet. But within that nature lies a truth that echoes across epochs. Nothing endures unchanged. Not continents, not civilizations, not even proof. The camera moves slowly across a panoramic reconstruction of an Earth that predates the rise of dinosaurs by hundreds of millions of years. It is a world so alien, so distant, that its landscapes feel almost extraterrestrial. Towering fungal forests dominate the Carboniferous horizon, their spore-laden air shimmering under dense humidity. Vast Devonian river systems carve winding paths through continents that no longer exist. Shallow Silurian seas pulse with early life, whose forms defy modern analogies. These epochs represent ages in which entire civilizations, if they had ever emerged, would now be unrecognizable, not because they left ambiguous evidence, but because the Earth ensured that no evidence could survive. This chapter is not an argument for the existence of such civilizations. It is an invitation to confront a problem far more profound: the impossibility of reconstructing eras so ancient that the very materials that composed them have since been dissolved, recrystallized, or consumed by Earth's interior. In this abyss of missing history, we find the conceptual backbone of reinterpretative skepticism. If we cannot definitively claim what did or did not happen during the majority of Earth's deep past, how can we assert that our own era's truths will remain eternally protected from similar erasure? The camera glides through reconstructed Cambrian landscapes, showing the explosion of life in forms so varied they appear almost otherworldly. Trilobites crawl across seafloors illuminated by unfamiliar light. Primitive predators glide through shallow waters, their segmented bodies reflecting evolutionary experiments that never repeated. These organisms represent only those lucky enough to fossilize under rare conditions. Most species from this era vanished without a trace. Life thrived, diversified, fought, and died in oceans whose sediments were later subducted, melted, and reborn as volcanic rock millions of years later. The absence of evidence is not a mystery. It is a geological certainty. Now imagine, the narration suggests, a hypothetical civilization arising during one of these forgotten intervals. Perhaps it was not biological in a familiar sense. Perhaps it was chemical, crystalline, or altogether non-human in its structure. Perhaps its achievements involved manipulating environments that no longer exist. If such a civilization left behind architecture, tools, or any physical expression of intelligence, these traces would be vulnerable to the same processes that erased almost all biological life from those eras. Cosmic radiation would degrade polymers. Heat would liquefy metals. Tectonics would crush geometry into indistinguishable fragments. Wind and water would erode any exposed structures into mineral dust. With enough time, nothing remains. The camera transitions to enigmatic geological formations found in rocks much older than expected, metallic spheres embedded within Precambrian strata, perfectly symmetrical structures appearing in layers where no complex life should exist, isolated anomalies that do not rewrite history but challenge its completeness. Each of these artifacts sparks debate, not because they prove anything extraordinary, but because they remind us that the geological record is far from exhaustive. What we call history is only a narrow window through which we peer at an immeasurable timeline. Most of Earth's story has already disappeared. This awareness deepens the tension surrounding modern events. The moon landing, for instance, is preserved through contemporary evidence: photographs, telemetry data, scientific analyses, and physical artifacts. But the question here is not whether the event occurred. It is whether proof, across deep time, can remain intact in a universe that dissolves evidence, distorts memory, and erases context. If prehistoric civilizations left no retrievable trace, not because they failed to exist, but because Earth's processes obliterated their presence, then the expectation that modern documentation can perpetually resist similar decay becomes unsustainable. The camera shifts from ancient landscapes to the imagined perspective of future beings studying Earth millions of years from now. They would find minerals where cities once stood, sediment where archives once existed, and metamorphic rock where libraries, laboratories, and satellites had long since collapsed. If such beings discovered anomalies, metallic remnants, or unusual isotopes, they might struggle to decipher their origins. Without context, interpretation becomes speculation. And speculation becomes the only narrative available. This resonates with the lunar paradox. Even if future explorers find lunar artifacts preserved in perfect clarity, they may possess no coherent lineage of knowledge allowing them to understand their purpose. The evidence exists. The meaning evaporates. This chapter closes by reinforcing the central question. If Earth can erase entire ages, leaving behind only silence, how can we assume that any truth from our own time will remain definitively provable across the same abyss? Prehistoric civilizations before dinosaurs serve as a philosophical mirror, reflecting the vulnerability of certainty itself. In their absence, we confront not the limits of science, but the limits of time. The camera rises slowly from the shadowed contours of Earth's ancient landscapes and begins its ascent into the cold stillness of space. Below, continents drift in slow motion across millions of years. Above, the moon waits in absolute silence. From this vantage point, the contrast between these two worlds becomes so stark, so philosophically charged, that it forms the narrative fulcrum on which this entire investigation turns. For the moon, unlike Earth, is a world that does not change. It does not recycle its crust, it does not erase its past, it remembers everything, and yet for all its perfect memory, it lacks the capacity to interpret what it preserves. This contradiction is the essence of the lunar paradox. The camera stabilizes above the lunar surface, where the harsh sunlight cuts deep shadows across impact craters billions of years old. Here, time is not measured in minutes or millennia, but in the sheer absence of change. Footprints left by astronauts will endure untouched until external forces, meteor impacts or solar radiation, alter them. A single tread pressed into lunar dust could remain intact longer than any mountain on Earth. From the standpoint of preservation, the moon is the ideal repository. It is the closest thing to eternity available to human hands. Yet this perfect preservation becomes misleading when contrasted with Earth's destructive dynamism. On Earth, information decays, context dissolves, and meaning erodes. On the moon, physical traces remain, but meaning is not intrinsic to the object. Meaning is constructed, interpreted, and maintained by minds that exist on Earth. In this sense, the moon can preserve the artifact, but not the explanation. It can hold the evidence, but not the certainty. The proof endures physically, yet becomes vulnerable conceptually. The camera glides toward the Apollo landing sites, presented here through a reconstructed visualization rather than any claim to direct imagery. Descent stages remain upright. Tools lie where they were placed. Tracks meander across the dust. These objects form a tableau of human achievement, frozen beyond the reach of wind or water. But imagine, the narration suggests, a future observer, a civilization emerging tens of millions of years after the fall of humanity, or a species visiting long after Earth has been remade by tectonic cycles. This observer would find artifacts without context, evidence without narrative, a scene without explanation. They might deduce that the objects are artificial, but they would not possess the lineage of technological development that links these structures to a specific civilization. They might speculate regarding purpose, function, or origin, but speculation replaces certainty when cultural memory collapses. Physical evidence alone cannot guarantee understanding. Interpretation is inseparable from the framework in which it arises. Without the continuity of that framework, even perfect artifacts become enigmatic. This is the core of the lunar paradox. The moon, which preserves flawlessly, simultaneously reveals the fragility of human certainty. The more enduring the artifact, the more glaring the eventual loss of context becomes. Meanwhile, Earth, our source of meaning, obliterates the very archives required to maintain coherent interpretation. A geological cycle powerful enough to erase entire prehistoric ages before dinosaurs is equally capable of erasing the contexts that support modern explanations. Thus, the paradox emerges not from doubt about the moon landing, but from the unavoidable limitations imposed by deep time. The camera shifts again, now showing a comparison between the lunar surface and Earth's shifting crust. The moon holds still. Earth reshapes itself. The artifacts remain eternal. The meaning does not. This comparison invites a reflection. If prehistoric civilizations existed in eras so distant that no trace remains, then the absence of evidence is not an argument against their existence, but a testament to Earth's destructive nature. Likewise, the presence of artifacts on the moon is not a guarantee that their story will remain intelligible forever. The moon landing is one of humanity's greatest triumphs, yet its proof, like all proof, depends on the endurance of interpretive continuity. The camera slows, holding on a single footprint preserved in lunar regolith. The narration continues with quiet intensity. This footprint is real. It is enduring. It will outlast entire continental arrangements. But its meaning is not inherent to the dust. Its meaning lives in human culture, fragile, temporary, and subject to the same forces that erased ancient worlds. The lunar paradox is therefore a lesson in humility. Proof is not merely about the presence of evidence. Proof requires context, continuity, and memory. These conditions do not survive geological time. They do not transcend extinction events. They do not withstand the cyclical erasure of Earth's surface. Thus, the moon landing becomes a philosophical device through which we examine the limits of certainty. A real event, supported by overwhelming evidence, yet incapable of retaining definitive meaning across the vast silence of future ages. The chapter closes with the camera drifting away from the moon, revealing Earth in the distance, vibrant, shifting, alive, forgetful. Between these two worlds lies a tension that defines the human condition. One world remembers everything, yet explains nothing. The other explains everything, yet remembers nothing. Between them, humanity struggles to understand its place. The camera descends from lunar orbit and returns to Earth, not to the familiar present, but to imagined ruins of a world long gone. Enormous river channels from the Devonian stretch across continents no longer recognizable. Lava plains from ancient volcanic floods cool under skies, saturated with primal gases. Sedimentary layers reveal faint imprints of organisms that lived and died hundreds of millions of years before dinosaurs ever walked. Here, the narration confronts a reality that reshapes the entire concept of proof. Evidence alone is never enough. Without memory, without continuity, without the interpretive structures that give meaning to physical traces, evidence becomes a silent relic, present, but not explanatory. The camera sweeps across a limestone cliff where thin fossils appear like whispers trapped in stone. They resemble symbols more than organisms, their stories half erased. These remnants survived only because conditions aligned perfectly for preservation. Most life from these epochs vanished without leaving anything behind. Now imagine, the narration continues, that intelligence, whether familiar or alien in form, arose during one of these ancient eras. Imagine cities built on deltas now buried beneath kilometers of sediment. Imagine technologies crafted from materials that degraded entirely. Imagine languages never fossilized, memories never recorded, achievements never preserved. Such a civilization could have flourished for tens of thousands of years and still be invisible to us. Not because it lacked impact, but because Earth's surface is not a canvas. It is a crucible. Nothing remains unless chance permits. This truth reframes the way we think about evidence. It reveals that proof is a temporary phenomenon, dependent on the survival of artifacts and the survival of minds capable of understanding them. The camera now transitions into a deep cave system, where stalactites form over millions of years and flowstones seal ancient voids. Within these chambers, traces of past environments are locked away, but only in fragments. A single mineral layer may speak of a vanished climate. A trapped grain of pollen may hint at forests that no longer exist. The mind attempts to reconstruct the whole from pieces that resist coherence. This is the challenge of interpreting Earth's history. What we call knowledge is often inference patched across abyssal gaps. The narrator poses a provocative thought. If prehistoric civilizations before dinosaurs left behind evidence, it would likely resemble anomalies we struggle to classify today. Mineral formations with inexplicable geometry, metallic spheres embedded in strata far older than human industry, unusual isotopic signatures with no clear biological or geological origin. These anomalies do not prove lost civilizations, but they remind us that evidence detached from memory is ambiguous. Without context, interpretation becomes a matter of narrative alignment rather than absolute truth. This leads to the philosophical heart of the chapter. Even if the moon preserves the artifacts of the Apollo missions perfectly, their meaning is not intrinsic. Their meaning depends entirely on human interpretation that requires culture, continuity, and context. If those vanish, then evidence becomes as opaque as any fragment from the distant past. The camera moves from subterranean chambers back to the moon, shown here as a world suspended in stillness. Instruments rest where astronauts placed them decades ago. Tools lie untouched. Descent stages stand as silent monuments. These objects are preserved not because they possess inherent resilience, but because the moon lacks the erosive forces that would dismantle them. They exist in a kind of eternity. Yet eternity without continuity is indistinguishable from obscurity. Now imagine a future intelligence, human or otherwise, arriving on the moon long after humanity has disappeared. They discover these artifacts exactly as we left them. But absent the cultural memory that explains their purpose, these objects become puzzles. Without Earth's interpretive lineage, the lander becomes a relic without an origin story. The footprint becomes a mark without a narrative. This is evidence without memory. It is preservation without meaning. The scene shifts again to Earth's ancient landscapes, reinforcing the contrast. On Earth, meaning is abundant, but memory is fragile. On the moon, memory is preserved, but meaning is absent. Between these extremes lies the central tension. Evidence in isolation cannot guarantee understanding. Proof requires continuity. And continuity is what Earth, through geological violence, consistently denies. This chapter concludes by drawing a direct parallel between prehistoric civilizations and the lunar narrative. The disappearance of ancient worlds reminds us that knowledge is always vulnerable to time. The preservation of lunar artifacts reminds us that survival does not guarantee comprehension. If meaning can be lost on Earth, it can also be lost on the moon. And so the question grows louder. How can we claim absolute certainty about any event when the universe itself dismantles meaning faster than it preserves form? The camera ascends from Earth's prehistoric silence into a conceptual space where memory fragments, narratives fracture, and the boundaries of what we call history begin to distort. This is not the timeline presented in textbooks or fossil charts. This is the timeline as it actually exists. Incomplete, discontinuous, shattered by processes that do not care for coherent stories. And it is within these fractures that reinterpretative theories find their footing, not as replacements for established science, but as philosophical tools that reveal the limits of what can be known with certainty. The camera moves across a sequence of jagged unconformities, those abrupt, jarring gaps where millions of years of geological layers simply vanish. These breaks represent not absence alone, but impossibility. They mark intervals in which Earth preserved nothing of its surface conditions. What organisms evolved, what environments flourished, what anomalies emerged, and what catastrophes unfolded during these missing eras are questions permanently sealed behind the rock. As we move deeper into this realization, the narration begins to draw a line between missing epochs of Earth's past and the fragility of interpretive certainty in our own age. The shattered timeline is not a metaphor. It is a physical reality. Consider the great Ordovician biodiversification event, where life flourished in extraordinary bursts of complexity. What preceded this diversification? Why did it unfold as it did? The geological record provides hints, but never answers. Consider the Permian-Triassic extinction, where 90% of marine species vanished. What chain of events led to such annihilation? Again, the evidence is partial, refracted through erosion and incomplete deposition. The past is not a linear narrative. It is a mosaic of surviving fragments surrounded by vast voids. Now, imagine intelligence emerging within one of these voids. not as we understand intelligence, but shaped by ecosystems completely alien to our own. Creatures capable of constructing systems, shaping environments, predicting cycles. If such beings built structures or technologies, those artifacts would be caught within fragile layers, prone to subduction or metamorphic transformation. Their presence would be erased so completely that future species, including humans, would assume those ages were empty. The shattered timeline invites this speculation not to claim alternative histories, but to reveal how aggressively Earth prevents us from reconstructing its story with precision. The camera transitions into an unsettling visual sequence. Fossils appear suspended within fractured rock, each broken by geological forces that cared nothing for context. These remains are like torn pages scattered from an ancient text whose plot we can no longer decipher. In some places, entire chapters are missing. In others, pages are fused together. Paleontology and geology reconstruct what they can, but the distances between fragments are too great to bridge with certainty. This leads directly into the moon landing narrative. The mission is supported by abundant evidence, yet its certainty is tethered to a timeline that assumes continuity. The telemetry, the photographs, the testimonies, the samples, all of these exist within a cultural moment that depends on the survival of human institutions. If those institutions collapse or mutate, the interpretation of these artifacts may fracture just as ancient histories fractured under geological pressures. The shattered timeline teaches us that knowledge is never permanent. It is always contingent on the structures that preserve and interpret it. To illustrate this point, the camera envisions a far future in which humanity has vanished, and another species attempts to reconstruct our history. They encounter traces of our existence, fragments of satellites falling through decayed orbits, remnants of cities embedded within future rock, and eventually, artifacts left on the moon. Without the continuity of human understanding, these observers would be forced to invent explanations. Some might align with reality, others might diverge entirely. This is not a failure of evidence, but a failure of continuity. Evidence without narrative becomes conjecture. Proof without memory becomes myth. The tension here is subtle yet profound. The moon landing remains a real event. Its documentation is extensive, but the belief that its proof can withstand the collapse of future timelines enters the realm of philosophical impossibility. The shattered timeline demonstrates that even the most extraordinary achievements are vulnerable to the same erasures that have consumed countless prehistoric eras before dinosaurs ever existed. The chapter closes as the camera returns to a time-lapse of Earth's geological transformations, continents drifting, oceans forming and disappearing, mountains rising and crumbling. In this endless cycle, human certainty becomes a fleeting phenomenon, dependent on windows of stability that do not last. The viewer is left with a reflection that deepens the mystery. If Earth's fractured timeline hides entire worlds we can never recover, how secure can we be in believing any proof will endure beyond our own fleeting age? Before continuing, a brief invitation. Like and subscribe to help this exploration reach others who seek to understand the mysteries hidden within time itself. The camera emerges from the drifting continents and fractured epochs of Earth's past and settles into a steady orbit around the planet. From this vantage point, Earth appears calm, unified, whole. Yet beneath the illusion of stability lies a world defined by erasure, transformation, and interruption. This is the foundation of a paradox that reshapes how we think about truth itself. The moon landing stands as a landmark achievement in modern history, fully supported by extensive scientific documentation. But when we examine the nature of proof through the lens of deep time, the very idea of definitive certainty collapses into something far more fragile than we expect. This chapter explores why absolute proof is not simply difficult, but conceptually impossible. The camera drifts downward through swirling clouds toward a series of archives, laboratories, and observatories. Shelves stacked with documents, reels of footage, digital servers humming with stored data. These repositories form the backbone of contemporary certainty. They allow scientists, historians, and engineers to reconstruct events with extraordinary precision. But every archive is vulnerable. Paper decays, film degrades, magnetic storage fails, language evolves, technologies grow obsolete. Meaning requires not just preservation, but continual reinterpretation. Without this, even the most compelling evidence becomes cryptic. The narration emphasizes a critical point. Proof is not an absolute state. Proof is a relationship between evidence, context, and understanding. Break any one of these links, and proof dissolves. This is where the impossibility emerges. The moon landing is documented exhaustively, but the interpretation of that documentation rests on cultural continuity, a continuity Earth has never preserved for any extended period. The geological record shows that civilizations, no matter how advanced, cannot rely on their stories surviving deep time intact. The mechanisms that shape Earth's surface destroy context long before they destroy artifacts. And without context, evidence loses meaning. The camera transitions to fossil sites where traces of ancient organisms exist without narratives. A single tooth reveals the presence of a predator, but nothing about its behaviors. A trackway shows movement, but nothing about the creature's intelligence. These fragments are evidence, yet they do not constitute proof of a coherent story. They are puzzles requiring interpretation. In the same way, a lunar lander preserved for millions of years could become an isolated anomaly, stripped of its historical framework. It might indicate that an intelligence once placed it there, but not who, why, or how. Here, the narration returns to prehistoric civilizations before dinosaurs. If such civilizations existed, their knowledge would have been destroyed by tectonic shifts, volcanic events, erosion, and metamorphism. Their artifacts could survive in part, but without context, they would be indistinguishable from geological anomalies. This hypothetical scenario is not a claim of alternative history, but a demonstration of how impermanent meaning is. It shows that understanding requires more than physical evidence. It requires a living lineage of explanations that Earth's cycles do not accommodate. The camera now moves into the imagined future, millions of years ahead. Human civilization has vanished. Forests reclaim cities. Oceans shift coastlines. Tectonic plates rearrange continents. Eventually, remnants of human presence become unrecognizable, crushed into metamorphic bands, dissolved by chemical reactions, or buried beneath kilometers of sediment. Yet on the moon, some artifacts remain, silent and enduring. A future species discovers them, but without surviving records, these objects become enigmatic. They confront evidence without explanation. They encounter proof without coherence. The moon landing, once so thoroughly documented, becomes a riddle. This scenario demonstrates the impossibility of definitive proof across deep time. Human knowledge, no matter how meticulously recorded, cannot remain interpretable forever. Every civilization assumes its understanding of the world will endure, but Earth offers no support for this assumption. The impossibility lies not in the event itself, but in the expectation of permanence. Proof cannot transcend the collapse of context. The camera rises once more, revealing both Earth and Moon in a single frame. Between them lies a stark dichotomy. Earth is the destroyer of memory. The Moon is the preserver of artifacts. Neither can guarantee the preservation of meaning. The impossibility of definitive lunar proof echoes through this contrast. The question is not whether humanity reached the Moon. The question is whether any species can preserve the interpretive structures needed to explain its achievements across epochs that erase entire worlds. The chapter closes with a quiet reflection. The moon landing stands as a triumph of ingenuity and exploration. Yet the universe, indifferent to human desire for certainty, ensures that no proof can remain absolute. Evidence erodes, context dissolves, interpretation fractures. And within this cycle, humanity discovers a humbling truth. Certainty is a fleeting phenomenon in a cosmos built on impermanence. The camera drifts into the darkness between Earth and Moon, entering a space where neither world dominates. Suspended in this void, the narration turns toward the final synthesis of two opposing forces: Earth, the planet that forgets, and the Moon, the satellite that remembers. Here, the documentary moves beyond geological processes and material decay, stepping into a deeper, more philosophical realm. It is in this space, between preservation and erasure, that the concept of cosmic memory emerges. Not as an alternative history, nor as a scientific certainty, but as a framework for understanding the limits of what any civilization can hope to record or prove. The camera shifts to a slow rotation around the moon. Its surface appears carved entirely from silence. Craters remain unchanged for billions of years. Every footprint persists. Every tool rests where it was left. Yet this immense stability is misleading. The moon remembers in form, not in meaning. It preserves shapes, not stories. It stores impressions, not understanding. Memory, as humans define it, requires interpretation. And interpretation requires minds, languages, and cultures, conditions that exist only on Earth, a world that consistently destroys the very continuity needed for memory to survive. Now the camera returns to Earth, zooming into an ancient mountain range formed from once molten seabed. These rocks contain minerals that were once shells, once organisms, once entire ecosystems. But the memory of these organisms is gone. What remains are chemical signatures and skeletal fragments, stripped of narrative. Earth remembers only inadvertently. It carries the physical residues of what once existed, but offers no context for them. In this sense, Earth's memory is neither cosmic nor intentional. It is geological. And geological memory is not aligned with human needs. The narration now explores a deeper contrast. Cosmic memory, if it exists at all, is not found in rocks or artifacts. It exists in patterns, in cycles, in the repetition of forces that guide the rise and fall of worlds. Stars are born, die, and seed new systems. Planets form, cool, and evolve. Life emerges, adapts, and vanishes. Civilizations, if they arise, become fleeting expressions of complexity within these cycles. The record of their achievements does not persist as proof in the way humanity imagines. It persists only as influence, transformation, or absence. The cosmos does not store evidence. It stores consequences. Returning to the moon landing, the narration draws attention to the philosophical tension. Humanity placed artifacts on a world where time moves without erosion, but meaning remains tied to the earthbound systems that explain how those artifacts came to be. If Earth cannot preserve its own deep past, if it has already consumed countless epochs, then the interpretive framework required to understand the moon landing is also temporary. No archive, no matter how comprehensive, can resist deep time. Proof becomes a momentary achievement, not an eternal state. The camera now shifts toward an imagined future, long after humanity has disappeared. Earth's continents reconfigure, mountain ranges crumble, oceans shift, new life forms evolve. Eventually, the moon remains unchanged, holding artifacts that stand as silent witnesses to an age no longer understood. These objects pose a challenge to any future intelligence that encounters them. They suggest intent without context, design without explanation, presence without narrative. In this future, the moon acts as a repository of form, but not of knowledge. This is the limit of cosmic memory. This realization brings us back to prehistoric civilizations before dinosaurs. Whether or not such civilizations existed is not the issue. Their hypothetical presence serves to highlight the constraints placed upon all attempts to preserve meaning. If entire worlds rose and fell in eras now erased by tectonic cycles, then the idea of permanent proof becomes incompatible with the nature of the universe. The prehistoric ages show us what the future will likely show others about us. Fragments, anomalies, incomplete signals whose original meaning fades into speculation. The camera once again settles between Earth and Moon, holding both worlds in the same frame. Earth glows with shifting weather systems, alive, unstable, forgetful. The Moon remains stark, still, and eternal, preserving form without meaning. Between them hangs the central paradox. One world remembers nothing. The other remembers everything except the story. It is in this tension that humanity confronts the limits of its desire for certainty. This chapter concludes by returning to the viewer's perspective. We are beings caught between worlds, one that destroys evidence and one that cannot explain it. And so, the cosmic memory becomes a meditation on the nature of truth itself. Not something preserved in stone or dust, but something temporary, contextual, fleeting. Something destined to fade, no matter how extraordinary the achievement. The camera glides downward from the suspended stillness between Earth and Moon and descends into a vision of prehistoric Earth unlike anything preserved in the fossil record. Not the familiar world of dinosaurs, but the far older realms that preceded them. Continents adrift through ancient oceans. Forests of towering lycophytes rising like green monoliths. Fungal giants looming over marshlands thick with oxygen. Coral architectures stretching across shallow seas like submerged cities. These are the forgotten theaters of life, worlds erased so thoroughly that even their light no longer reaches us. And it is within these environments that the concept of the Great Return begins to unfold. The Great Return is not a literal event. It is a philosophical step back into the vastness of deep time. It is the act of revisiting the possibility that intelligence may have emerged in ages so distant that every physical signature of its existence has been consumed. It is a return not to historical certainty, but to the humility required to confront the scale of Earth's past. When we step into this abyss of geological possibility, we begin to understand how fragile interpretation truly is. The camera hovers over the Devonian, where armored fish known as placoderms dominated an ecosystem both violent and thriving. Their remains survive only because sediment entombed them quickly. Without such rare moments of preservation, their existence would be unknown. Now imagine a lineage of organisms within this era developing capabilities unrepresented in the fossil record. Imagine structures built from organic materials unsuited to preservation. Imagine forms of cognition that left no trace in stone. The absence of evidence is not a dismissal. It is an acknowledgement of geologic probability. This uncertainty becomes the key to understanding the Great Return. When humans consider prehistoric civilizations before the dinosaurs, they often ask whether evidence exists. But the more appropriate question, the philosophical question at the core of this documentary, is how evidence could survive in the first place. Earth's deep time does not simply erase artifacts. It erases meaning, continuity, and the very frameworks that would allow later civilizations to understand what came before. In the Great Return, we recognize that knowledge is not lost because it is false, but because it is fragile. The camera shifts to an imagined ancient shoreline, now transformed into quartzite by eons of pressure. Within the crystalline veins of these stones, minerals form geometries that seem intentional but are the product of natural processes. And yet, the boundary between natural formation and erased civilization becomes conceptually blurred, not because of evidence, but because geological time strips away distinctions. A civilization subjected to hundreds of millions of years of metamorphism would leave behind nothing discernible. Even intentional structures would be crushed, melted, recrystallized, or subducted. This insight reveals why modern expectations of definitive proof are incompatible with the reality of planetary history. Humanity views the moon landing as an event embedded within stable frameworks, archives, museums, scientific institutions. But Earth's own cycles make it clear that stability is illusory. The Great Return teaches us that even if modern evidence survives physically, its meaning cannot endure indefinitely. Proof requires interpretation. Interpretation requires memory. And memory is the first casualty of geological transformation. The camera now shifts from prehistoric Earth to a juxtaposition with the lunar surface. Footprints in lunar dust perfectly preserved. Mechanical artifacts undisturbed. Descent stages gleaming faintly under harsh sunlight. These objects appear eternal when compared to Earth's restless crust. Yet this eternity is deceptive. Without the interpretive continuity of human civilization, these preserved forms become as mysterious as any anomaly embedded within metamorphic rock. The moon can preserve the artifact, but it cannot preserve the story. The Great Return leads us back to a haunting philosophical realization. If civilizations existed before the dinosaurs, their absence from the geological record does not imply they never existed. It implies that proof was impossible to preserve. In the same way, a future intelligence encountering lunar remnants long after humanity has vanished would face the same dilemma. Evidence without memory. presence without narrative, a truth preserved in form, yet dissolved in meaning. The camera moves to a wide shot of ancient Earth's cycles repeating, oceans advancing and retreating, continents merging and splitting, life emerging and disappearing. This vast sequence connects the forgotten past to an unknowable future. The Great Return is not merely a journey into ancient epochs. It is a mirror held up to our own time, revealing the provisional nature of all human certainty. If Earth has deleted entire chapters of its own story, how can humanity expect its story to remain intact? This chapter closes with a reflective pause, emphasizing that the Great Return is not about proving or disproving lost civilizations. It is about understanding the fragility of knowledge itself. In this recognition, the central paradox becomes clearer than ever. The moon landing is real, but the permanence of its proof is impossible. The camera rises from the submerged forests and vanished continents of prehistoric Earth, ascending into a realm where the familiar markers of time dissolve. The sky fades into darkness. The Earth curves below, luminous and shifting, its surface a tapestry constantly rewritten by forces older than life itself. Suspended above this planet of perpetual transformation, the narration guides us to a threshold not defined by space, but by understanding. This is the boundary of knowing, the invisible line beyond which human interpretation can no longer reliably reach. The boundary of knowing is not a distant frontier. It is present in every fossil we struggle to interpret, in every geological gap that interrupts Earth's timeline, in every historical fragment whose meaning we reconstruct with partial information. It is the point at which certainty becomes impossible, not because truth is absent, but because the mechanisms required to preserve truth no longer exist. The moon landing, so thoroughly documented in our era, becomes the central example that reveals this conceptual threshold. Its evidence is abundant, its reality unquestioned. Yet its permanence as a comprehensible event is limited by the same forces that erased prehistoric worlds before dinosaurs ever emerged. The camera shifts to an array of ancient rocks exposed on a windswept plateau. These stones contain no inscriptions, no images, no coherent narrative. Yet scientists extract meaning from chemical signatures, isotopic ratios, and mineral structures. They infer past climates, microbial ecosystems, and environmental catastrophes. But these interpretations, however grounded in evidence, remain interpretations. A different species in a different era might reconstruct a completely different story from the same fragments. The rocks do not speak, they merely exist. Meaning is something observers impose. This is the heart of the boundary of knowing. Even when evidence is available, interpretation is shaped by the perspectives, assumptions, and models of the interpreting civilization. Prehistoric ages demonstrate this vividly. In the Cambrian, life suddenly diversified, yet we cannot reconstruct every step that led to this explosion. In the Permian, destruction swept across Earth, yet the precise interplay of causes remains elusive. Even with evidence in hand, the narrative remains incomplete. We know enough to form a story, but not enough to guarantee that story is final. The camera transitions to a visualization of the moon landing's telemetry data, footage, and scientific documentation. This archive is vast, coherent, and well-preserved by human standards. But it is vulnerable to the same fragilities that plague all knowledge systems. Records decay. Digital formats become unreadable. Cultural memory evolves. Interpretive frameworks shift. It is not the evidence that becomes suspect, but the continuity required to make sense of it. Without this continuity, even the clearest data becomes indistinguishable from anomaly. The narration invites the viewer to imagine two scenarios. In the first, humanity remains intact for thousands of years, preserving and passing down its knowledge of the Apollo missions through stable institutions. In this scenario, the moon landing remains a comprehensible chapter in human history. In the second scenario, human civilization collapses, reorganizes, or transforms. Archives deteriorate. Languages change. The connections between evidence and explanation weaken. Eventually, future generations discover lunar artifacts but lack the interpretive lineage to decode them. The moon landing becomes enigmatic, a mystery once understood but no longer solvable. Both scenarios are plausible. Deep time favors the second. This uncertainty mirrors the challenge of interpreting prehistoric civilizations before dinosaurs. Whether they existed or not, they illustrate the limits of human epistemology. If a civilization rose in the Devonian or Carboniferous, its traces would be erased by geological processes long before the first mammals appeared. The evidence required to prove or disprove such a civilization would be destroyed. Not because the truth is controversial, but because Earth is a planet that destroys continuity. The camera now retreats into the darkness of space, placing Earth and Moon side by side. Earth turns with vibrant atmospheres and shifting clouds. The Moon remains still, holding its silent archive. But neither world can guarantee the survival of meaning. Earth erases. The Moon preserves without explanation. Together, they form a dual system that exposes the paradox of proof itself. The narration concludes with a reflective insight. The boundary of knowing is not a barrier that prevents discovery. It is a reminder that all discovery is temporary. Human knowledge exists within a narrow sliver of time where conditions allow memory, interpretation, and meaning to exist together. Beyond this sliver lies the vastness of geological time, a realm where truth is preserved only in fragments, and understanding must be reconstructed from what survives. The moon landing, viewed through this lens, becomes not a contested event, but a philosophical demonstration. It reveals that certainty is not a property of evidence, but a property of continuity. And continuity is something Earth has never promised. The camera drifts away from the boundary of knowing, rising slowly into a field of silent starlight where Earth and Moon become two faint, distant spheres suspended in a darkness indifferent to their presence. This final chapter gathers every thread woven throughout the documentary and places them into a single contemplative question. When all is said and done, when civilizations rise and collapse, when continents drift and vanish, when archives fade and memories dissolve, what remains of us? What remains of anything? Not the certainty we cling to, not the narratives we construct, but only echoes carried forward in forms the future may not understand. The camera descends again, not into any one era, but through all eras at once. Deep ocean basins where ancient microbial mats once thrived, flooded Carboniferous forests glittering with the glint of dragonfly wings, arid Permian deserts where reptilian ancestors traced fleeting paths across dunes, Cambrian reefs teeming with life so alien that it feels almost speculative. These are the worlds that came before, entire ages swallowed by Earth's relentless cycles. Their stories are not merely incomplete, they are unknowable. They leave behind impressions, not narratives, fragments, not meanings, questions, not answers. This is the mirror we must hold up to ourselves. If such vast and extraordinary epochs have vanished without leaving a decipherable record, what hope does humanity have of preserving its own truths across the deep reaches of time? The moon landing, monumental though it is, becomes a case study in humility. Its footprints and artifacts endure on a world without weather or tectonics. Yet the story that explains them, how they came to be, why they matter, resides on Earth, a planet that protects nothing. Human memory is carried by civilizations, and civilizations are carried by fragile systems that fracture under the weight of time. The camera shifts to an imagined future where Earth has long since reshaped itself. Oceans reclaim coastlines, mountains erode into plains, forests rise and fall. The remains of human cities become mineralized outlines within sedimentary patterns. The complexities of language fade into undecipherable symbols. The sciences, philosophies, and stories that once defined us collapse into fragments that future observers might never interpret correctly. And somewhere, beyond the shifting crust, the moon remains unchanged, holding objects whose creators may no longer be remembered. In this distant future, a new intelligence might approach the lunar surface. They discover footprints too perfect to be natural, mechanical structures inexplicable in their geometry, a descent stage that stands as a monument to a species that is nowhere to be found. These beings possess evidence, but evidence alone is insufficient. Without the lineage of interpretations that once connected these artifacts to their origins, what remains is an echo, clear in form, empty in meaning. The moon remembers the shape of our achievement, but not its story. The camera returns to Earth, where deep time continues to carve away at the remnants of the present. The fractured timeline we explored earlier dissolves the boundaries between what was and what might have been. Lost civilizations before the dinosaurs serve not as alternative histories, but as philosophical reminders that entire worlds can vanish so completely that proof becomes irrelevant. Their absence reveals the true scale of impermanence. Their silence speaks louder than any narrative we impose. Here, the narration softens. Humanity stands in a precarious moment, a moment in which our knowledge remains coherent, our archives intact, our interpretations continuous. But this moment will not last. Geological time does not permit it. The impossibility of definitive proof emerges not from contradiction, but from the simple fact that meaning cannot survive the collapse of memory. The moon landing is real, but its permanence as an intelligible event is no more secure than the lost epochs buried beneath our feet. The camera settles on a final image, a single footprint on the lunar surface, illuminated by the distant sun. It is both fragile and eternal, delicate and indestructible. It is the perfect symbol of humanity, an imprint left upon a world that cannot change, yet destined to be forgotten by the world that can. And so, the echo we leave behind may not be a story. It may not be a proof. It may not even be a memory. It may simply be the silent presence of something that once existed, now awaiting interpretation by minds we cannot imagine. If this journey stirred your sense of wonder, share the video and subscribe to continue exploring the mysteries hidden across time, worlds, and civilizations that may have risen and vanished before our own.